Right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to what has turned out to be me streaming once in the every blue moon at this point. But no, we're back, and I'm back with a friend of mine, Nathan Hood, who's been on this channel, been a guest on my channel on numerous occasions. I think the last time Nathan you were on here, we it was the New Year's. It was the New Year's, and we were talking about the coming tide and what we could expect, and just talked about storytelling. In
Mhm.
fact, it was again a bit of a response to your stream with Connor Plotlines on the state of storytelling in our society, um, and I guess tonight in a similar fashion we're talking about um, a world and a book, a trilogy that we all have been inspired by and been interested in, and which is Lord of the Rings. And you put out few days ago a YouTube short where you have, I guess, in your words, you were sick of Lord of the Rings. So can you just explain, like, how this has happened? How what's your sort of feeling on this? Because as I said before, what was amazing is that many people in your comments and myself watching that
Mhm.
understood you perfectly. It wasn't like this guy's lost his mind. What's gone on here?
Yeah.
I understood it, and a lot of us understood it, but I can't. At that particular moment, I couldn't put my finger on it why I understood it, but I implicitly knew because I guess I've sort of thought to myself, in similar ways, I like it, but there's something about when I read it that I feel quite sad. There's a bit of a
Mm.
sad effect to it. Um, so sorry, yeah, take it away.
I mean, there's multiple parts to that question, and first, let me just say thank you for having me on. It's always a pleasure to be here, pal, and it's nice to be talking about this topic because Tolkien is one of he's been a massive influence upon my life in terms of his writings, in terms of thinking about his work. As you've mentioned, I've spent countless hours on YouTube by myself, with yourself, with somebody like Apostolic Majesty, going into quite a lot of analysis about the Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion, the extended writings of Tolkien that were never published as like a finished book, and really developing a knowledge both in terms of the kind of uh, the imaginative world's history and facts and so on, but also the deeper underlying themes of these stories and the ideas that Tolkien's trying to explore. And that's been a process over several years. Even before that, I loved the Lord of the Rings, right, growing up, and it was something to imagine being Aragorn and fighting in the playground at break time against a million orcs. That isn't a dog whistle, by the way, just to be clear. Um, but the thing is, though, it's like it developed even further from when I did YouTube videos. I've had an article on Tolkien published in an academic journal, and this kind of process or this kind of change in me, I guess there's a number of things that happen, but one is that I started to write a book on Tolkien, specifically Lord of the Rings, um, because I felt that if you had just watched the movies or even just read the book, there's a lot in there that you might not pick up, especially as we live in an age which doesn't share the same worldview or vision of the world, or even a vision close to that of Tolkien's. For example, in the book, there's a lot of language and a lot of discussion of people being chosen, but they're not chosen by Elrond or Gandalf or so on. It's always left mysterious. You've not been chosen by me, Elrond says to Frodo when he takes the ring. You've been appointed to this, but who's appointing him? It doesn't. It's never mentioned. if you read Tolkien's other works, it becomes evident that this is a providential power, a power which created the universe and is kind of directing the course of history through free agents. So when you understand that, a lot of things start to become clear in the story, and you can really see it bursting with this kind of exploration of divinity within through the story of Middle Earth. So I wanted to write this book, and I've probably written about 5 or 6 chapters of it already. But when you're writing a book, you're really breaking down a thing, right? You're looking at, you have to collect quotations, for example. You have to mine it for certain information, and so on. And that process started to make me lose sight of the magic of the stories, because no longer were they something to kind of lose myself in. Actually, I was bringing a different kind of analysis to it. I was bringing a kind of rational, deconstructive analysis. So when I thought, okay, I've not read The Lord of the Rings in a long time. I'm doing all this research. I'm doing all this analysis of it. I should read it again, because I've kind of lost a bit of the sense of wonder. I open the pages and I start reading about, the first chapter in the Shire, and I just couldn't do it. I found myself frustrated and a bit repulsed by it, to be honest. It felt kind of hollow and shallow. Now, at the time, this was a kind of horrifying experience to me. Like, I've loved these books and I've done much to commend them, and I do believe in their value. I hope the way I'm talking about it shows that I don't denigrate these books. I think they have real worth in them. But I had lost something of that. And I think there's other reasons we can go into, but that's kind of how I kind of came to that realization. And then the short
Mm.
itself, I'll just say this very quickly, is because that was quite a while ago. I recently I've come to kind of reflect on the fact that um, a lot of the time we can be very performative online and trying to fit into an ideal of what let's say a right-wing online guy should be, and part of that is like venerating Tolkien, for example,
Mhm.
and that's got its place. You don't want everyone subverting everything all the time. Actually, we need standards, we need ideals, but we also have to be honest, and in honesty we can touch on things which get very deep about ourselves and our experiences and about reality. And so confronting this head on, I felt was a good thing for me, but also for the audience that I have, and also is kind of indicative of where I want to be as a YouTuber. I don't want people just to follow me because I'm playing up to expectation. Actually, I want to be true and honest with those who watch me, and hopefully they deserve that much at least. So that was kind of why I decided to make that short.
No, I think anyone watching this and your short would definitely be able to see that you were very sincere. This wasn't like it doesn't discredit anything you put out before, any content that came out before. It's not like you it's not like you're saying, actually, I love the Rings of Power. Tolkien, get out of the way, old white guy. So it's nothing mad like that. Uh,
If that ever happens, I would tell everyone unsubscribe from my channel. If I like the Rings of Power, you know,
well,
boycott.
I would assume like you're being held like at gunpoint or something, or you're being blackmailed by MI5 to say
I,
something mad like that.
I probably would have accepted a Ring of Power from a beautiful man called Anatara. That's probably what would have happened.
Yeah, yeah, corrupted you in all capacity. Yeah, I mean, for me, I think there is something when you overanalyze something, and I mean, on a small level, and I've talked on my channel quite a bit of like the Star Wars books, and
Uh-huh.
in particular, my I still and it's the Plagueis novel. I think out of all the Star Wars books out there, I mean, it's better. I actually view it better than most films, even films by under the George Lucas era.
Mm,
I think it's a fantastic story. It has a lot of reactionary right wing themes in it. It is incredibly based as a novel goes. It's shockingly based. I'm surprised it was ever allowed in some quarters, but I have analyzed it myself, and for streams, I've even tried to put together like an alt, like put it in like a like I guess you say like retell the story in a different way, maybe so it
yeah.
fits plot holes and everything. And one thing I found was actually I got bored of it very easily because I've
Mm,
only just analysed it. Um, the problem is, well, you know where it's going to go, you know what's going to happen. That's the most obvious point. But
yeah.
then you think of the characters and you're like, actually, um, I don't want to like overthink these characters because number one, this character is just straight up, in the universe, he's morally evil. He is literally Satan, or he's meant to be the pinnacle of evil, and then this character is meant to be the pinnacle of good. But then the character of the pinnacle of good is also surrounded by people who do good, but are actually doing more harm than good because they're stuck in a temporal institution which has deviated. So that's like you quite the Qui-Gon arc with the Jedi Order as at large. Um, and so I understand that where I've sort of looked at it and it's like there's only so much you can there's only so much you can deconstruct. And also that with the Star Wars books, there's always that thing where all roads lead to the Skywalker saga of it. It has to lead always back there. And it's not a bad thing because I think it works. Those that deviate from that, it doesn't necessarily work out too well in my view. So that's how I've understood it. And I think with Lord of the Rings, um, yeah, I mean, yeah, you've done many videos on this, streams. You had Tolkien Day with Apostolic Majesty and other people who also cover Middle Earth content, Tolkien content at large. Um, and I think, I mean, for me, one thing I read the Fellowship again last year, probably I think about November, and when I was reading it, one thing that did sadden me, and I was just thinking about it, was when in the Shire, because the way that The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings is introduced to people, especially first time is it's the Shire, it's the hobbits, it's the society of the Shire. And it's basically just mirror even though it's set in the fantasy world, it's mirror of rural England. And I think it's done like that and it's introduced that way so it isn't so daunting because the trouble with fantasy worlds is you have to have the writing it, you have to have the balance of keeping it simple enough that people won't get confused and lost in the jargon and terminology of the fantasy world, but also so it's sort of unique enough but can be grounded. So there's like a difficult balance. I think Tolkien was able to put that perfectly together for special people, especially for people who, at this time, you have to remember you had sort of like fantasy novels and as such, but nothing really on this scale. Nothing in recent memory. I mean, beyond like say Beowulf and the sort of Norse and Anglo-Saxon mythologies and other mythological sagas, but you had um, the way that he introduced this world was through basically rural England, village life in England, and it was sad. It saddens me because when you think of the state today, after the Boris wave, after the social, and I mean, I know people talk about the demographic change of England, but the actual social change that has occurred, the breakdown in community life, where it's either performative or it's non-existent in many even part rural community state. It's a total social breakdown. Um, and it saddens me when I read about the first few chapters of the Shire because it feels like a part of my country that has has disappeared, and it's a reminder of that. And also, what's the other sad thing is at the end of Return of the King, when they return, and what's happened to the Shire, it feels very prescient now on what's happening now in rural England. Um, you know, I mean, I think like on a, not to go too extreme, but like solar farms, but like building, government building on greenbelt land, all that sort of stuff. And so when I read Lord of the Rings, I can't help but just think of what, or from the Hobbit's perspective, you know, what's happened. And there is a part of me that you think, well, what was it all for? What was, what was gained from it? I know in the films they don't have the harrowing of the Shire because I think Peter Jackson, he said that he didn't want the audience to feel that it was all for nothing. That it was all for nothing. That they returned and the Shire had to be intact. But in many ways, I don't like that. I think because then it's not it's more of a tragedy then, isn't it, than anything else. But of course, they overcome Wormtongue and Saruman. But that being said, for me, I have this sense of sadness with Lord of the Rings, but because it feels like a sort of England that has passed, um, and maybe Tolkien, when he put together the Harrowing of the Shire, there was a large social effect when troops were returning from World War One to Britain and to their respective countries. You had the rise of revolutionary Marxist groups. You had a very extreme transformation in places like Germany and other nations in Europe, of these sorts of organizations and groups, and these now newly created republics. So it did, for many people, it felt like society had been pulled out from underneath them while they were on the front lines and trenches. So maybe there's that to it as well. But yeah, what I was going to say, what do you think of that?
Oh, there's a lot of good stuff there. I think there's something that you've touched on, which I actually wrote an article on about a while back, on the need for a new kind of hero in fantasy literature, or in literature from
Mm,
Tolkien. So I'll say a little bit about that, because Tolkien's heroes, by and large, are characters who are guardian types. They're guarding something which is precious and good. So take like Aragorn. He literally does this before the start of the story as we know it. He and the Rangers are on the borders of the Shire, and they're guarding it against the monsters outside. And this kind of trope follows a kind of Anglo-Saxon model of heroism. So
mm,
Beowulf, what's he doing? Well, he's a glorious character. He's trying to find his own glory by defeating Grendel. But ultimately, he's defeating Grendel because Grendel is attacking the settlement, right? And same with
yeah,
the dragon. He exists to defend that place. And that is the model for the heroic for many, many centuries. And Tolkien builds that into his story. The difficulty comes when you exist in a place where there isn't that left to defend, right? And I think that's what you're kind of touching on with the
yeah,
nature of the Shire. The Shire doesn't exist anymore, or at least it's what's left of it is being very quickly eroded. So that kind of hero who's a guardian figure doesn't fit well. And you can kind of see this with the tensions of something like Batman, which I know has been discussed before.
mm,
But Batman is a guardian character for a city which is utterly corrupt and decadent. And actually, he often guards a regime which prevents change from taking place. Uh, the only people who are allowed to want change in Gotham are the villains, right? The
yeah,
actual people cannot do that, and Batman reflects that by being the guardian. In a way, what we're looking for is our heroes who the destroyer creator kind of archetype, who tear down an old decrepit, corrupt, wicked system, a wicked ruler,
Mm.
and replaces them with a new order. Think of something like, this is going to be a very kind of superficial analogy, but I think of something like the Lion King. Simba
Right.
comes in, defeats Scar, restores the true bloodline, or not the true bloodline, but the true king is restored and the land flourishes once again. That's the kind of heroes we need. We're kind of in that bit where Scar is in charge and the hyenas
Like
are
like a sort of King David figure.
King David, yeah. Jehu, if you
Yeah.
know your Bible, Jehu wiping out the priests of Baal. Uh, I'm not advocating anything that strong, but I think it's that kind of revolution, restoration sort of character.
Yeah.
Odin is an example of this as well, or these sorts of figures like Odin, Zeus, who overthrow the previous realm, previous lords through violence, for example.
Yeah.
Like Odin killing Ymir, the first giant, and thus taking kingship essentially. That kind of character is more what we're needing, at least. And so the world, so it's bound up with the world, though, isn't it? Right, because the
Yeah.
world that Tolkien's describing doesn't need that yet. The world we live in does need that kind of thing, and as a consequence, there's something kind of doesn't connect with us in that respect. I think there's other issues with the Shire, but I think that's one of the. I think you've touched on something quite deep there about it.
I do. Yeah. I mean, now you say it on a subconscious level, maybe it's this the sort of sadness that I've sort of thought about was actually these guardian figures could Aragorn and Legolas, Gimli, Gandalf, everyone who helped Frodo and Sam, and Merry and Pippin on this journey, that they are this guardian figures, but because the way that the world is today, it feels like they're actually guarding, that they're guarding the sort of unheroic nation, the unheroic society. And
Mm-hmm.
so on a very subconscious level, without sort of thinking, you have that sort of resentment, that sort of sadness and resentment towards this, because you're thinking to yourself, yeah, that when I said there's something off about it, that actually does ring true. There is that sort of resentful feeling about it. And the type of character that we have, that we can draw on. I was listening to a Bowden talk, Jonathan Bowden
Mm.
talk, and he was talking about so the Indo-European traditions, and sort of the culture of it. And he was talking about in one of his tangents, he talked about how in sort of like Hinduism you'd have these these titan figures of old who would
Mm.
be beyond good and evil, and they would sort of roam and be sort of enact extraordinary levels of violence. And this is my superficial bit. I was thinking of Elder Scrolls, because I'm sort of into the lore of Elder Scrolls, and I was thinking, like, uh, if you're aware of like the foundations of the Cyrodiilic people in Elder Scrolls, they had
Mm.
been oppressed, they had been enslaved by elves, who worshipped the demons within the Elder Scrolls world, and their savior was of course this prophet, this prophet Alicia, but her bringer, her sort of divine revenger was this uh Pelennor White, I think it's Pelennor White Strake. I apologize if I'm forgetting the name correctly, but he was like this um titan figure who
Mm.
was beyond good and evil, because you could argue his actions obviously being good and evil, but he it wasn't about that. He was just pure um pure destruction of that society and its people, and he did. I mean,
Mm.
he did. The stories in there is that he just wiped out the Aliad demon worshipping elves. And so and that was in a time of where they didn't need a guardian, as you said. They didn't need a guardian to uphold that society. They needed it to be brushed out, and those people
Mhm.
to be brushed out and start anew. And then, of course, later on, the guardians of a society like the Remen and Tiber Septon and figures like that, they were more of a guardian figures because they were protecting what existed. So I actually think, in some ways, that is sort of a very um y- that is a very sort of clear observation now, come to think of it.
Well, you should buy my book. No, I'm joking.
Yeah.
But I think, but you're right about the state of things is part of that, and it doesn't therefore mean that Tolkien's a bad writer. It means that there's a certain level of applicability which isn't necessarily there in his work at this current moment. In that respect, I think
Mm,
there are other ways it does apply, and there's lots of great insights in there. But it's just an enjoyable tale. But as a kind of frame of as something to draw upon beyond being a good story, it limits its power in this current moment, precisely because of what you've just said. Whereas even in Tolkien's day, there was still some of that Shire left, or some of that good culture being eroded, no doubt. But the fact that you could have like himself and C.S. Lewis and Owen Barfield meeting to discuss scholarly matters and debating their stories and so on. This isn't something that really happens very much apart from online now. Uh, so like that's been driven away in many respects. So there was more there. Um, and just to Vingle's point in the chat, because I see he's saying applicability is overrated. I generally agree with you. I'm not saying that that's the standard to judge a work by. My point is more that we're talking about why does it not resonate so much
yeah.
necessarily, and that's partly why. That doesn't mean it's a worse work for it. Like that does in no way does that denigrate its quality. Um, you see the same thing with King Arthur, for example. King Arthur, it's a tradition of stories going back more than 1,000 years, but he kind of rises to the surface at different times in history
Yes.
in English culture, well, British culture. It's not a constant love of King Arthur. It's at certain moments he seems to resonate with people, and so I think it's just the same thing as that, really.
Yeah. Sort of the romanticism of Arthur. Yeah. You have that. I mean, you have those periods in the 19th century and stuff. All that sort of comes back, and I think with Vingo, I think it's not that Nathan is spreading disenchantment. He doesn't. The point is when Nathan was reading the Fellowship, he didn't have the same you know feelings that he had before. And he said, and in his YouTube short, he said, I read this and I was sickened by it. And I couldn't carry on reading it. And that, for me, the reason why we're doing this stream is because that is something that I understand, and that many people understand, and I'm sort of interested to see why that is the case. And some of it is part of over analyzing, so constantly analyzing, deconstructing the world. And actually, Matt might get onto the deconstructing point. um I think, and this is where we have to, Nathan, we're gonna have to kill the liberal within you. You have to kill the liberal within you. But that I do think on deconstructing anything is kind of, touching the Planthia, if you will. It is touching. I think there is sort of inherent. dangers with doing that, because then you start looking for inbuilt societal liberal sort of values and aspects to draw upon. And I think that um I think that in itself can burn you out on any sort of thing. But because one of the famous things, and I've never been a fan of Game of Thrones. I know the people in our spheres that like Game of Thrones, and I know, I've I tried to read the books. I have watched the TV show. I'm just not really into it. And I'm not really into it because um uh, because of usually just like I would describe sort of unrealistic and out of control and sort of endless levels of violence to it. And I'll explain a bit later if we get onto it. But yeah, I do think I remember George Martin saying, um, what about the tax policy of Gondor? Who maintains the road networks, and you can deconstruct, you can go into the most like ridiculous levels, and it's like, well, yeah, who cares? It's like, how many outhouses are in the Shire? I don't know. No one wants to know. No one's asked that. Nobody's interested in that. But yeah, there is a point where I think you can get to the point where you're just ending up delving too far, and you end up missing you end up deconstructing to a point where you'll sort of just end up looking for fault, not so much faults, but you look for faults, you look for themes, you look for things which maybe are or aren't there. um and yeah, I think some of these works you just have to um not leave be, but you have to maybe take into account like the time it was written in, the time it was, the audience it was for. I mean, what do you think of that, Nathan?
I think there's a useful distinction by the poet Samuel Coleridge, who was a romantic poet, and he makes this distinction between imagination and fancy. Imagination for him has a double meaning. Firstly, he thinks that all of our perceptions are mediated or used by the imagination to create our kind of experience of the world. So we don't just receive things passively. Actually, our minds kind of receive the sense data and then transform that into our consciousness. Right. But the second sense of imagination is a much more like what we would use it for, which is a kind of creative power which has the ability to take the sense data and memories and so on and combine and add and so on and bring things together as a whole. And this is the kind of origins or the real thrust of the of poetry. Poetry takes things which are actually literally not kind of identified together. So David is a lion, for example. But at the same time, through that kind of poetic form, there is a union brought between the lion and David, and thus opening up a new kind of coherency between the two, and a creative place, a magical space almost, where there's room for searching thought. Fancy is much more of a kind of analytical approach, where you take two realities, so like David and the lion, and you don't really combine them together in any way. You just see them as separate realities that interact. So the only way that you could have them in the story is not through the metaphor of David as the lion, but actually David must confront the lion. They're two separate realities. They cannot be combined together. This, for Coleridge, has deeper thoughts, because what comes from there further is a fundamental difference in attitude. The imagination is the basis for religious, transcendent, mystical experience of the world, because looking beyond what is literally there and seeing how it integrates and interconnects and can be synthesized with other things, which thus leads to a sense of the wholeness of things. Whereas the fancy, because you're seeing everything as distinct and uniquely different from each other, you're then ending up in a place of categorization, rational models of things, and taxonomies, and so on. And that kind of attitude, if followed through to its conclusion for Coleridge, leads to materialism and so on. So what I was doing was a work of fancy. I'm breaking down the wholeness of a narrative form, and I was trying to give concrete kind of particularity and explanations to things which in Tolkien's books are left intentionally unexplained. In so doing, I would have been reducing the kind of magical character, the transcendent character, and ended up with a kind of dry, arid, what Tolkien himself would have called a withered leaf. He talks about this in his essay on fairy stories, this kind of approach. The person who questions the fairy story ends up with withered leaves in his hands rather than a beautiful tree. So I think that distinction between imagination and fancy points to what you were talking about, and has helped me to kind of understand partly why spending all this time analyzing Tolkien had kind of drained the life of it for me, and had made me feel kind of awful reading it. And I think, just to clarify that point, I think it was more than just boredom or dissatisfaction. I think it's because I got so stuck with the concepts that the narrative itself had kind of become almost jarring to me. That's a kind of strange thing to experience, but it felt like it wasn't, like I needed to get beyond it. I needed to go down into the concepts. In a way, I'd missed the narrative, which was the far more important thing. And that's partly why I don't know if I say this in the short, but I don't plan on publishing this book, because while I don't think for others it would necessarily have that effect, the fact it did that to me makes me question whether it's worth sharing.
No, and yeah, I do think, that is the trouble when you sort of are so into something. It can, was it love, I think it was about like love-hate relationship. It's a bit, so not saying you're like Gollum with, like, with the ring, but you're so invested in it, but you hate yourself for doing it, but you love it at the same time. But um I mean, yeah, just to sort of clarify, people in chat, that there are themes and characters and behavior of characters within Lord of the Rings which makes the story of what it is, what makes the books what it is, where they're timeless, whether it's, the sense of duty, heroic nature, and everything. Um, but I do see where you're coming from, and um, I think the difficult thing, and maybe, people won't sort of like me saying this, but you, as you said, with like the Arthurian legends, Tolkien was, he is like a sort of uh, a writer who would be sort of like a legendary writer in his own right, and maybe, in some matters, the sort of works of Tolkien sit on the back burner and then come back in the future. So it sort of not leaves like public consciousness, like, in its entirety, but like the Arthurian legends, it goes and then comes back when, at the right time. Um, I think what's really interesting is when you think about the Rings of Power, and I mean, I know everyone say, well, they're not real Tolkien fans and all that sort of stuff, but in some ways, a lot of people who are, you know, who know a lot about the world of Middle Earth, who are, I guess, like online shills, as we would call them, right? Who know a lot about Middle Earth, know a lot about the law, and were able to support it and back it. and saw it. I think some of them even saw it before, us and as members of the public were able to sort of look at that, because I have watched a few episodes of it, so I know roughly what it's like, and saw nothing like wrong with it. Um, and so one thing that I am concerned at is that people would then project their own sort of values, their own ideas onto Tolkien and his work, which doesn't work in itself, because then you end up having diluted stories. You end up having sort of like these corrupt stories. And I mean, one of the things I remember saying in the stream was, where if you look at the world of the Rings of Power, that version of that Middle Earth, it's just basically it's just like a fantasy world that's in San Francisco. It's just San Francisco in Lord of the Rings, and you have like this sort of racial society, where nobody really appears to be distinct. Every position is equal. It's just a modern America in the fantasy world, which makes sense, right? Because America is the cultural, the cultural and world hegemon at the moment, at least. So it makes sense that something like that would be the case. But that's something that's always concerned me, is that it's so many people project what is now onto that piece of work, um, and it totally just takes away from what Tolkien was writing, from his experiences and what he put into the Lord of the Rings books.
Very much so. I mean, it's to be expected to a certain degree, because the Lord of the Rings books have a strong uh, reactionary message, and there are many people who love and hate Tolkien who have said that. Um, he is seen in some circles as the worst thing that ever happened to fantasy, which is quite which is quite uh, it tells you more about them than it does about Tolkien, about their politics and so on. But the fact is, when you watch those films or you read the books, uh, if you haven't been doing what I've done and destroyed your love for it, it resonates and it chimes and it talks to something deeper than conscious thought. It goes beyond what you were talking about earlier. It goes beneath the liberal mind and taps into natural instincts, uh, traditional values which tie into those natural instincts, ancestral memories, you might even argue. But that totally conflicts with everything our conscious brains have been taught. And so for people to kind of reconcile with that, they're going to have to project it into it or change it in some ways. I think the Peter Jackson films were very good, but they kind of drew back a little bit, just in subtle ways, but they drew back on some of the more reactionary elements of the film, of the books, and thus made it a bit more easy to project into it, just to enjoy it, whatever kind of political persuasion you are. The Rings of Power obviously just goes way beyond that and imports its whole own political philosophy in a form which doesn't work with that political philosophy, because the form of things in Middle Earth could not be produced by the liberal world order. So it's very jarring then for it to be hammered, like forced into it, right? You wouldn't get like the Kings of Numenor produced by modern American democracy, evidently, right? Look at
Yeah.
how the presidents have been in the last while. Do we really believe that Joe Biden would have ever been king of Numenor? Well, maybe they did go off the rails at one point, I suppose. But even then, they were like they were world conquering leaders. They were not doddering old men manipulated behind. Although they were manipulated, to be fair. So maybe there is more of a comparison than I'm giving credit for. But you know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think in that sort of in that sort of comparative, it was already sort of accepted that that was the decline. Everyone accepted that that was the decline of Numenor, or even, I mean, if we sort of talk about the books and the films, we talk about Rohan,
Mhm,
talk about King Theoden and his sort of possession by Saruman, and he, you know, in the films, he was depicted as this doddering old man who could barely string a sentence together. And I know many people put memes together of Joe Biden and everything. And you got Wormtongue being the like the special lobby in the background whispering uh,
mhm,
for that power. But even in that context, the liberal mind was, it's like, oh, there's nothing wrong here. This is just, don't believe your lying eyes. But then, obviously, in the Lord of the Rings, sort of the example you put forward here, everyone everyone knows there's something wrong, that evil is at foot here.
mhm.
So yeah, even even in the Lord of the Rings example, when you have like a bad king, a bad emperor, a bad emperor, a bad ruler of any sort, it's known, it's a known thing,
Mm.
and that plays into the story. um
Maybe
and
maybe
you're
the better way for me to put it is, okay, you might end up with the bad king in Middle Earth, but you would never get the good king in modern American democracy.
true, true. Absolutely. And that's actually another thing, because one of the things, and this is where I sort of, equality does,
Hmm.
which is the foundations of America, and liberal ideas that permeate out into our society and everything. Equality doesn't produce anything of value or anything great. I do not believe equality can produce greatness, because I actually believe greatness, it comes directly from inequality, and it comes because it's usually from a very group of exceptional people that can produce greatness. If you
Hmm.
take, I do not believe anyone else, any other man, could have replaced Aragon. I don't believe Tolkien would have believed that either. I don't believe any other elf could have replaced Legolas, or even any other hobbit. As you said, it had to be Frodo to carry the ring. It had to be Aragon to be the guardian. It had to be all those, and Gimli and Legolas, all to be guardians. And it even had to be Boromir, who
Hmm.
even in who and I think many people think he failed, but the fact that he was able to redeem himself um, shows also that sort of level of that redemption, a level of greatness as well. Because of course he never, in the end, he upheld his duty. And so I honestly, and I think, I always talk when about on this thing, is that if you look at any sort of, like, in our contemporary world today, um, art, architecture,
Hmm.
all of that was never created by, through equality. It was always through exceptional inequality.
Yes, it was. I actually did a stream a few weeks ago on Renaissance architecture, and there was this bit. There was a poem by W.B. Yeats, and he wanted funding for an art gallery, and uh, he asked a rich man for help, and the rich man said, "I'll do this as long as you can prove that the citizens of the city actually want the art gallery." So then Yeats wrote this scathing poem where he was like, do you think the Duke of Urbino in the 1400s asked the shepherds for their advice on whether he should build his palace and have
Mm.
great artists attend his court? Do you think he did that, sir? And it's so yes, he was not he was not best pleased with that. So and it's the very nature of genius, actually, is to um I mean, there's a lot of work gone into this, but one theory is that oftentimes we seek comfort and safety. I think that's very evident in our society, but not just on a material level, but in our intellectual and emotional lives. We maybe find something that we find solace in or satisfaction, and then we get stopped there. We don't keep moving on because it's a kind of safe thing, and we let our identities be totally formed by that thing and almost become static and stationary, almost a stereotype of that thing, perhaps.
Yeah.
Now that is not what the genius does. The genius keeps moving beyond those stopping points. And take somebody like David Bowie, for example, who I would see as a great man of the late 20th century in terms of his artistic achievement. He doesn't just stop at his early stage, right? He doesn't just stay as Ziggy Stardust. He totally remakes himself in his look, in his music, in the kinds of songs that he's making. It changes. And then he does it again. Or Bob Dylan does this too, right? The contrast is the Rolling Stones, who great rock and roll band, but they're like playing the same kinds of song. What, 60 years later? That's the contrast that I'm trying to make. The true genius doesn't settle. He's always reaching out beyond the safe place, including mass society. So how can a genius ever be produced by everybody being the same or collective decision making? It cannot be. It cannot be by its very nature. So I agree with you on that point.
Yeah, and the genius usually by their contemporaries are either heavily misunderstood or
Hmm.
even hated and despised.
Oh yeah.
Um, and the sad thing, and this is the tragedy with these sorts of figures, is they never see the fruits
Mm.
of of what they produce because it's usually after their own deaths that it sort of uh, comes to fruition. I think that's just a reality of all things relating to these sorts of figures, and
Mhm.
I think that's but that's one aspect.
I wanted to pick up on something you said earlier, actually, if I may,
Yeah,
because you mentioned about everyone having their place, or so like Aragorn. Only Aragorn can be the High King of Gondor, and Frodo is chosen for his path. You mentioned Boromir. The interesting thing about Boromir, you're right that in terms of the history of Middle Earth, he is doing what has, well, we could debate this, but he's following through a plan, unintentionally following through a plan which will lead to the destruction of the ring and so on by this higher power. But for Boromir himself, what's interesting is, so he tries to take the ring for himself, right?
yeah,
So there's two people that he is usurping their role. Firstly, there's Frodo, because he's trying to take the ring from the ring bearer and it's kind of acting like, I should be the ring bearer. I'm more powerful than you. I'm stronger than you, and I can do more with it than you. So there's Frodo, he's usurping. There's also Aragorn. Now, he never says this explicitly, but those of you who've read the books and even in the films, you could sense that, and there's a bit of antipathy between the two because Boromir, son of the stewards have been ruling Gondor for centuries now. Aragorn, in the books, it's made clear that it's more than in the films that he is the rightful heir to the throne because it's like a long distant line which has been missing for generations.
mm,
But Boromir, what does he want to do? He wants to get the ring and lead the well, Gondor primarily, but men in battle against Sauron. But that's Aragorn's role. That's what he is appointed to as the king of Gondor. So Boromir, the lust of the ring is it promises you great power and leads you to try and usurp other people and take their roles for yourself. That's one of its temptations. And ultimately, Sauron is the clearest example because he wants to be king of kings. I think it says in the Silmarillion, right? And by that I just mean the book, not the specific story. He wants to rule over all things, either destroy that which opposes him or enslave it. Fundamentally, he wants to be God. In what limited way he could possibly make that be. So he is trying to usurp the divine role. So the very temptation of the ring is to usurp what is not yours. But by the same token, everybody has their role to play in the divine plan. And that includes the great warriors like Aragorn and the smallest hobbits as well. So it's not like only some people therefore have roles. Actually, we all do. We all do.
Yeah, it's interesting. Do you think, because given the time that Tolkien wrote this in, do you think Boromir was like revolutionary Marxist coded in that in that brief moment where he tries to usurp, take it from the ring bearer, take the responsibility away from Aragorn? Do you think that was like a sort of way of displaying sort of the selfishness of like the Marxist revolutionary at that time?
I don't know about that, to be
That
honest.
might be a bit of a stretch to come. That
think
might be a bit of a stretch to draw upon, but
I think
yeah,
it was more a well. Tolkien talks about Denethor being basically a nationalist and Machiavellian, and
right.
only being concerned with Gondor. With Boromir, there's that streak too of being a nationalist. Like he only cares about Gondor; he doesn't care about the rest of the world, basically.
Mm.
But it's more pride which is driving him. Uh, that he believes he should be the one to do this, that he's capable of doing it, that maybe it's even his right to do this. So he's kind of stepping beyond his own limitations and his role as the son of a steward rather than the son of a king.
Mm.
So I think that's more. If you want to look at kind of Marxism, people have pointed to the Scouring of the Shire, where the hobbits are forced to are basically taxed, and there's collectivization uh, through taxation, which then leads to the ruffians just taking all the best stuff. This is seen by some as a kind of reflection on communism or socialism.
Yeah. I mean, I know in a historical context, a few have, I think probably even AM has drawn, I think AM drew on similarities where you had the Merovingian, the Franks, the Merovingians, and how the Carolingians, who were the mayors of the palace, which is like the position like Stuarts, like the Stuart of Gondor. The mayor of the palace was effectively like the administrative head of the Frankish realm, and how effectively the title of king just became a very weak figurehead, and really it was the mayor of the palace that was running the show. And then of course you had the figure like Charles Martel, and that's when the Merovingian era ended. You had the start of the Carolingians, and then led to the infamous Charlemagne, where he sort of restored the honor and prestige of the title of king, and the father of Europe and all that sort of stuff, and that sort of that golden age there. Um, but I mean, in the difference is that you did have a the mayor of the palace. You did have a king who was present, but the thing that was the monarchs there were weak and incompetent, and everybody knew that they weren't really a king. They were or monarchs. They were just these puppets, these weak puppets. And I think like they even went the mayors of the palace even did like these really bizarre humiliation things, really, like rituals with the kings, like make them ride donkeys or mules or something like that. There was like these very bizarre humiliation rituals. But I mean, of course, yeah, the heroic, what gives them sort of divine legitimacy is that, of course, they kick the Islamic armies out of Gaul, out of France, out of the Frankish realm, out of Europe. Well, not out of Europe, minus Spain, but out of the Frankish realm. And I know many have drawn on that, and that is a sort of an obvious comparison there.
Yeah, it's a good comparison, and I think just a kind of interesting side note. You mentioned the stewards basically becoming the kings. Well, the Stuarts in Scotland were the stewards of the kings, and eventually rose to prominence. So that seems to be a common, or at least a common situation, really, where a noble stewarding family eventually overtakes. And maybe there's a certain logic to that, because if you're the ones managing everything, then you have the real power over the situation. This is one of the great kind of battles, really, between. Yeah, I think through history, your figurehead who actually rules is often in competition with the bureaucrat or the administrator who actually does the detailed work, and who has the power in that dynamic, and that relationship is quite a difficult thing to manage, especially as the advisors increasingly make things more complex and technical, uh, in part to develop their own power, in part to be more efficient, but also because then it gives them more sway over the king. He can't understand it all necessarily. So I think that's quite an interesting dynamic, that sometimes the stewards actually become the kings.
Yeah, and it happens. I mean, the modern example that I can think of is like in the early 2000s in Burkina Faso, you had the nominal president, but then you had like one of the ministers and like like the interior minister or finance minister or something like that, and they were the ones that actually ran the country with the backing of the paramilitary military organization, and so even in modern modern sort of quote unquote democratic republics, you have this false head and then the actual brain behind this the actual figure. um and sometimes even political parties on a non-state level, political parties do this. You have the nominal head of the political party and then the actual you know, chairman financing, sacking, expelling uh, uh, people he doesn't like, mentioning no certain names, but I think we can all sort of guess who I'm referring to there. But who basically has de facto control over the party, uh, which normally would be for the party leader, but that's it happens. I think it's you know there is, I mean, and that's why you see in like, in certain medieval, in societies, they take the Anglo-Saxon, you actually had like a form of a council, of actually like a meeting of other nobles, precisely to avoid that sort of, because it's human nature, it happens. And is to avoid. I mean, I think probably the Parliament, the English Parliament, was a way to avoid that sort of that to avoid all those sort of figures around the king of having that sort of figure to arise, and that is I mean that is something that even continues to this day.
Though it's interesting that look at the Tudor period, Henry VIII. Who is it that's running the government? Is it Henry VIII? Is it Thomas Cromwell, who's
Yeah,
driving much of the policy and the execution of policy far beyond what Henry wants? Or maybe that's the wrong way to put it. Far more than Henry knows, and Henry's quite happy not to know as long as the coins come in. It's yeah, these figures seem to arise throughout history. I've been reading about the Plantagenets, and there's several of
mm,
these chancellors and archbishops who uh, become very meddlesome in the king's affairs, but and become, by their own kind of abilities and networking, able to essentially become a rival power. to the king within his own country. So yeah, they're a dangerous force, especially when it's interesting because many of these people are appointed by the kings, but in time grow to such a strength that they're able to kind of stand without the king. So it's an interesting, whereas the nobles have their power from their land and their authority over an area, their lineage. They're not dependent on the king for their power in that respect. Um, so it's a kind of funny role that doesn't fit within the rest of the feudal structure, but somehow
No.
it allows the mobility of certain men of talent who can then exploit that situation.
Yeah. I mean, I think, with Game of Thrones, you have like the most extreme
Mm,
examples of it takes it to the extreme, and um, even within the historical context, you do have examples where if they take it too far, there's usually punishment that goes with it.
yeah.
I remember reading about the life of Alfred the Great,
Mm,
and Bishop Asser, who was his closest ally in 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 the Wessex court, was
yeah.
pretty much like the Mister Fix-It for Wessex. Especially, that's how I would describe him. He was kind of
Yeah.
like the center. Like if you were to say, okay, the kingdom's falling apart, you've retreated into the marshes of the West Country. Who's sort of keeping everything? I would say that was Asa. He seemed
Mm,
to be the guy who knew how to get I mean, Alfred obviously was a very important figure in on himself because of he was king, and also he was he was literate.
hmm.
He understood also on a bureaucratic level more so than probably most other monarchs at that time, because of course he had to take that sort of training.
Hmm.
And but he able to coordinate seemingly well at a point most kingdoms at that time just totally collapsed.
Yes.
And I mean, that's the thing. People talk about. I mean, Wessex at its lowest point was basically just a few fields in Somerset and parts of southern Devon. Was your England, sir. That
Hmm.
was your England at one point. And how quick, even in that scenario where effectively the land was overrun by Guthrum and his host, they were able to coordinate uh, a decisive response, which would ultimately defeat them. But that's an example I guess Asa knew his place. He wasn't. He was also Welsh. He was a Celt. He wasn't from the Anglo-Saxon people, so he wasn't. I guess you could say there wasn't any chance or any sort of you know aim, and also he was quite a reluctant figure. I don't think he rather wanted to stay in Wales. He didn't necessarily want to get involved in all of the court life, but um, he wanted his sort of monastic lifestyle. But the like Frodo, greatness was sort of thrusted upon him.
Very much so. He didn't have much choice in that matter. I'm
No,
glad he didn't. He was the right man for it.
no, absolutely. And and that's an example of where a sort of a bureaucratic figure does good in the sense of he doesn't usurp the
Hmm.
position, he doesn't exploit he doesn't exploit it for and he could have done. There are plenty of people. You had Udder of Devon, who was I mean, there were plenty of figures.
Mm.
The Earl of Somerset, whose name forgets me now, but could have
Yeah.
sided with the Vike, could have done that, didn't didn't do it. And that sort of just shows a testament to if there was a similar scenario today where England was overrun by a hostile army, could I say the same of our supposed regional rulers today, our local councils? No, I can't. To betray the land, no. Um,
Well, you mean you don't have confidence in Andy Burnham to lead the resistance?
oh no, no, To be honest, I think he would be even more. I don't even think the hostile army would even want him. They probably know how no sort of daft that man is. But
Mhm.
yeah. No, I mean this has been a good discussion though. On this, and uh, yeah, I knew that this stream would probably, though a lot of people might feel that not really, not really understand what we're getting at here fully. That this might be like, oh, why are you spraying this, this disenchantment thing about Lord of the Rings? And we're not really set. I mean, I used that title. It was sort of, I wanted it to be it's a bit clickbaity. I will admit that that's on me. This is a clickbaity title here, but I do think that there is, we have to be honest to ourselves. And Nathan was honest enough to say that he didn't feel the same reading Lord of the Rings. He felt, he didn't feel that same level of satisfaction that he had before. Um, I understand it. We talked about it, and there's multiple different avenues that you can go along of why we felt like this, and that being over analyzing, deconstructing it. Uh, the fact that the Guardian, the nature of the themes of it don't feel as relevant today, so it has this subconscious effect that it doesn't resonate as it used to be. And then I think there's also like multiple other things that maybe other people could draw on. Um, uh, that I mean another thing I also find, and this is, I mean, this isn't really a fault, but so many because Lord of the Rings is the sort of center of all fantasy, modern fantasy today. um Whether it be in like the Elder, I mean the Elder Scrolls directly comes from Lord of the Rings. The actual lore creators of that universe were what originally was just a group of people on a forum, an online forum in like the 90s, who
Mm.
were Tolkien Hobbit Lord of the Rings fan group.
Yeah.
Actually, a funny thing is, and I don't people don't usually know this, but it was 8 people online, and the head of the group was a chap called Smaug. His username was Smaug, and then under him you had this lady called Mara. Now, people who know Lord know,
Mhm.
and you had Zen as well. Now, people who know the gods of Elder Scrolls, that there are, well, normally 8 gods, plus the
Mhm.
9 one, but that's a separate matter. Um, and the creators of the from that group, that sort of Tolkien group, were used as gods in the, so Smaug became, because he had a separate sort of username, was Katosh, so it was like Akatosh.
Ah,
There you go.
yeah.
Yeah. So
And
that's
the
how
dragon symbol, right? Smell.
Smaug, that's right. Dragon symbol being because of the sort of Akatosh in that is a dragon. He's the father of dragons, which is, you have
Yeah.
Alduin, which Alduin I think is also characters drawn mainly from Norse mythology. The dragon on just destroying the tree and all that of the world. Um, and then you have Mara, who is the goddess, and you have all these other people who were immortalized in that, which I think is kind of cool, because I know a couple of them have
Mhm.
passed on now, so it's nice to think that they've been immortalized in that. But even from that, the structure of that of Elder Scrolls, it is Lord of the Rings.
Mhm.
And even Game of Thrones. I know I know he will claim not to be, but even it's undeniable that there were uh aspects from um, Lord of the Rings which makes its way into Game of Thrones. Maybe in a very subtle manner, not direct in themes, but maybe in the aesthetic side of it, and the uh, the sort of social structure. Um, And because there's so much content of fantasy world now, and then you go when you're exposed to that, and then you go back to Lord of the Rings, it does feel a bit. Um, you have to remind yourself, no, this is ground zero for it. This is like the original.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, I
that
mean, I think there's a few things there. One is that I agree with you to a certain extent. Something like Warhammer, for example, is also heavily influenced by the Lord of the Rings in terms of its form. But I think a lot of the content of modern fantasy, um, it comes from a different tradition, and there's different ways you could draw it. But I think it kind of definitely begins, or it reemerges with Michael Moorcock, who wrote the uh, Elric series, which are much
mm,
more morally grey. The main character is a bit of an anti-hero to a certain extent. It's more dualistic, the world, and there's a lot more horrible suffering that's kind of gone into in a way that, okay, that's there in Tolkien, but there's not this kind of delicious joy in the suffering that you find in that or Game of Thrones, for example. So I think, and even Warhammer, I think, is kind of in that world more than it, because there's like chaos gods and law gods and so on. That's it's not really Lord of the Rings to me in terms of its feel, uh, in terms of kind of how the world works. Although there's a comparison to be made, the idea of like a fallen angel, I don't see that so strongly in some of these. So a bit of being Sauron, I mean, or Morgoth. So I think the form is Tolkien, the substance is actually anti-Tolkien a lot of the time, or very different from Tolkien. And I know Moorcock was explicitly trying to do something very different from Tolkien's work. Um, but I think beyond that, that's kind of a side point. I think beyond that, there's a it's you know, Caravaggio in the chat mentioned, is this a disenchantment with mythology in general, or legends in general, or stories in general? That's quite a difficult question to answer, but I'll answer it in two ways. Firstly, no, I am deeply in love at the moment with kind of ancient mythologies. I'm fascinated by Greek mythology and thinking about Prometheus and Oedipus and Sisyphus. And these three in particular really have kind of exerted my my energies, but then also medieval history, mythology, and legend surrounding King Arthur, surrounding the Plantagenets, and so on. I'm enjoying exploring those worlds, and I think the contrast there's two contrasts here. One is somewhat thematic, and others have pointed this out. Tolkien's work, that is the Lord of the Rings, let's be precise, not the Silmarillion. The Lord of the Rings is a series of eucatastrophes. So the terrible situation of defeat is suddenly overturned. There is victory by an unexpected force, and it's a wonderful, kind of marvelous recovery. This is not like the tragic character of Greek myth or even Arthurian legend to a certain degree. So I think there's a difference in substance. But even beyond that, because I think even that isn't a major issue, right? The main thing for me is that in a way I've exhausted Tolkien in terms of the spirit of it. I've exhausted it in terms of cataloging everything. There's nowhere left for me to go in a sense. There'll always be something small. But in terms of the big things, it doesn't feel like there's any room to grow or breathe. And I wonder if that's part of it for me. Whereas in these other things, there's lots of room for me to do that. But I'm going to be more cautious about kind of breaking everything down. It's just that it doesn't feel like there's any room for that anymore, which is a really sad thing. And I don't think it's necessarily true. It just feels that way. So yeah, I think that's part of why I've kind of gone down this route.
I mean, that would be one thing that would be interesting is if you go down the route of like Mediterranean Greek mythology and writings and stories, and then compare it to the sort of Norse and Germanic mythologies on a sort of like civilizational level to understand where both groups come from, because I know there are books out there that talk about the difference between the Latins and the Germanics and the sort of outlook. I mean, on a side note, I went through my early teenage years obsessed with Greek mythology. I was incredibly obsessed. One of the ones was the Minotaur. I really loved Labyrinth and the Minotaur. I was involved with the Bristol Old Vic once, even helping them film. It was my eternal shame, Nathan, in many ways, because I allowed a very, very bitter socialist woman to get too much power onto that and absolutely turned it into I mean, yeah, that's a different story. But the point is, the point is, um, I was very, very sort of fascinated with that sort of story, but also one thing that I noticed is that I love one thing I like the Greeks is they love the tragedy and the failure, the failure of it, but also the win from it. So failing at one thing, but winning, maybe winning it out, or even just pure out failure. And also the relationship with the gods and man, because the gods and the goddesses, how much they actually they influence the people around them, especially like love stories and stuff like that. It's very it's very personal. It's not so much as removed. It's very personal, and they don't make themselves, to be clear, they don't make themselves in like sort of animal form. It's mainly like in person form. It's like other people in person form, which is a very interesting one, and I think it's you find it quite common in those sorts of med cultures as well. It's sort of highly communal, maybe a product of like the city states, that sort of thing, a very sort of communal outlook on it, these great city states. But I think and when it comes to deconstructing it, I mean, I can tell you now, you'll have a lot of sexual assaults and incests involved, but I hate to tell you, but especially by like the likes of Zeus and Hades. But
Yes.
Yeah.
I guess like, because it's interesting you use the word deconstruction. In a way, I don't want to do that anymore. I want to enjoy and maybe, rather than kind of break down and catalog and categorize, which I guess there'll always be part of that there, and I don't think it's inherently evil, right? But it'll be within a context of, okay, what's the whole here? How do all these things combine? And maybe even not just focusing on it from a analytical, rational point of view, but just meditating in a kind of emotive or subconscious way, just letting it be, sitting in silence with it, letting the thoughts kind of enter your mind, trying to approach it not purely from logical brain, because I think these stories are the whole reason. This a story doesn't just speak to the mind; it speaks to the heart, and on very deep levels. So letting that be, rather than just the waking liberal mind dominating. I will tell you one difference though that I've come across already. In previous things too, is that so there is a tragic aspect to a lot of Greek stories, But there's this kind of other side to Greek legend, which has Zeus as king of the gods. He's overthrown his father Kronos. He's defeated Typhon, who was he Uranus's son or something like that? The great
Yeah.
threat to his age. He has devoured his first wife, who would have given birth to a son that could overthrow him. Genius plan. And therefore, no one can overthrow him now, right? He is king of the gods forever. His reign will be eternal. There is no story in Greek mythology of Zeus being overthrown. In contrast, Odin, Wotan, he lives in a world where he has risen to power, much like Zeus. He's overthrown a previous generation. He then he then rules over for a long time, but eventually we have Fimbulwinter and Ragnarok, when the monsters, the giants, band together and overthrow the gods, and Wotan is killed, Valhalla is burned, and the world needs rebirth once more. Now, this is very different from Zeus reigning eternally, and you kind of see this in the
Yes.
culture. Rome, which takes on Zeus in the character of Jupiter, it's the eternal city, right?
Yes.
That's what they called it. That's what they believed, that they could be, everlasting. Whether they believed it in their hearts of hearts, some of them may have, some of them, especially later on, may have not. But there was this kind of conventional saying, as long as the Vestal fires burn, Rome will last. And I think that's very different from the northern viewpoint, which naturally fits in with like the Wheel of Fortune idea, that there'll be a time of rising and a time of fall. And Wotan finds that, Beowulf finds that, Arthur finds that. So that's quite a stark difference. Although I hold out hope, because Zeus managed to overthrow Kronos, and nobody thought that would have been possible. So maybe his son will find a way to escape from Zeus's devouring and overthrow him too.
No, there is something to that. I mean, I actually, I was on the sort of deconstructing thing. I actually think if you would do like an honest, non-liberal type of deconstructing, what you find is just paganism at its core, like the actual pagan mindset at its core in these stories, both in Norse and Greek mythologies. You find the sort of how pagan mindset of these people work, and what it is it's very similar, but it represents itself in an ethnocentric perspective. And I think on a historic level, whenever you've had sort of either natural in the sense of a sort of climate level, or um uh, tribal level, the Germanic peoples move southwards. And so you do have times of extreme flux and change, and where tribes and clans are absorbed into one. Some go extinct. So there's kind of like there's always that fear of the Ragnarok happening to them, and you have uh, in sort of in the Greek sort of sense, maybe you have that sort of protection, that sort of geographic. You have that sort of protection in the Greco world. But yeah,
Mhm.
that sort of level of protection. But no, I mean, it's just a thing. I think I did a video actually on here on Narcissus.
That's
It
right. I
was
remember that.
Echo
Yeah.
and Narcissus. Yeah,
Did you not
that's a
also
good one.
do it on his name's totally gone from my head. He plays the harp.
Oh, yes, yeah. Hold on a sec. Uh, yes. I did.
Oh,
Oh
that's gonna
no,
annoy me. What's his
that's
name?
not. I uh, yes, I do know who you mean. Oh, Eros and Psyche.
Oh, you did Eros and Psyche. So
I
sorry, I meant Orpheus, didn't I? Yes, another love
yeah no
story.
uh yeah Eros and Psyche. Yeah, now that's a good one. That's a
Mhm.
good one to look at and that I sort of concluded that particular story is dedicated um to for women. I believe that sort of particular myth
Mm,
was a story for women and how to navigate um, femininity in the Greek world. That was sort of the sort of ideal. In many ways, you have like the sort of bitter and vindictive mother-in-law figure that poor Psyche had to contend with in goddess form. But yeah,
that seems to be a commentary. I guess you've got Hera. Is it Hera and Athena? Like,
yeah.
constantly at each other's throats, and Zeus is trying to mediate between the two of them constantly. You're thinking, okay, the writer of this myth clearly had an insight into this from experience.
Yeah, and it also shows Psyche becoming a better woman. You know, she isn't just
Mm,
driven by pure lust or sort of any sort of materialistic. She actually takes the effort to go out there and prove herself, which she does.
yeah.
I mean, she goes through, she jumps through like these ridiculous benign tasks, but she's able to follow through and because her devotion and love to Eros is stronger than anything else, and she proves that.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
didn't know, but anyway, listen. Thank you so much, Nathan, for coming on. We're going to wrap this up now. It's been a really interesting discussion, and uh, I'm guessing because people have sort of been asking, does this mean? I imagine in the future, if it's not like you saying I'm never going to talk about Tolkien or Lord of the Rings ever again. This is just
Hmm.
um, a snapshot in a moment where you were reading it and how you feel at the moment. You want obviously you're going to go and do something back, but it's not like you're not in some point in the future. You're not going to. It's not like you're totally giving up on that sort of world or anything else like that. It's just
Yeah. I mean, Vingel's been commenting, and then there may be value in taking a long break from it. Um, but I think it's not something which I will be kind of actively trying to um, if somebody asks me a question about it, I'm going to comment, and I would thoroughly promote Lord of the Rings and encourage anyone who wants to read it to go and do that. I just won't be completing my book on it, and I won't be kind of streaming about it. But I think there's plenty to be streaming on, as I've done for a little while now on other topics. Uh, there's a lot more to do with, like, I'm very interested in doing more on the Plantagenets and their history, because I think there's one of the things I love. I've got to share this with you, Shiator, because I think you'll appreciate this.
mm,
Many of the moments, especially in the life of King Edward I, but in others like Richard the Lionheart and so on,
yeah.
they are like legends come to life. Some of the
Oh yeah,
tales.
totally, totally.
Um, like I remember when Edward was actually imprisoned while he was a prince, right?
Yeah,
After the Battle of Lewes, when his father was defeated, Henry III, and his escape was quite amazing because he was allowed to go out and about as long as he had his attendant jailers, basically. So, but imprisonment for a prince was different from your average prison.
yeah.
Well, one time he goes out into the forest hunting with a friend was able to visit him, and the guards were there too. And they take turns trying out each other's horses and to see which one was the fastest. Well, Edward, when he's found out which horse is the fastest, he stops and turns around, and I can't remember the exact phrase, but he says something to the effect of, "Well, it is time to say goodbye to you. Say hello to my father, who you have imprisoned, and I will be back to overthrow you once again." And rides off into the distance on the fastest horse out of the bunch of them. He then meets up with the rebel barons who are going to help him, and he promises to restore justice, good law, expel aliens, punish criminals, and restore Plantagenet monarchy once more. And you're just like, you know, if you wrote that, it would be an amazing story. But Edward lived it. He lived this
Yeah.
story. So there is so many characters like that who I'm like, yeah, I want to discover more about these people.
No,
Um,
I mean a Plantagenet series would be I mean a deep dive into the Plantagenets is fascinating. I mean for me I've always been fascinated with Edward the Black Prince. Um he's seen as an extreme villainous
mhm,
figure in France and in the Aquitaine for because of the pillaging and everything, but for obvious reasons. But um I think what's extraordinary is his the martial spirit for that is it's like
mm,
almost like an ancient pagan warrior. It's bizarre, and how
mm,
so young. I mean, he of course what made him famous was he killed, or defeated and killed the king of Bohemia, who was it's very rare
mm,
that kings would die on the battlefield at that particular time in that sort of
that's
manner.
right.
So and so he and Ceres. I mean, there was one great narrative documentation of the Battle of Ceres where they saw him and his entourage charge in, and their banner fell in the midst of battle. And his
Mm,
father, the king, was like, "No, I need to wait." And as the banner rose up again, and it was like the sign of this incredible victory. And
mm,
he came very descriptive. He was covered in blood and everything, and it was a very gruesome. And he became and the moniker of Black Prince was just of how this incredible I talked about earlier these titan figures of beyond good and evil,
mm.
extreme violence. There's that he was very much that, and it's such a tragedy. He died before becoming king. 'Cause he would have been an incredible warrior king, especially for the Hundred Years' Wars. But yeah, he's a fascinating figure in himself as a young prince. Accomplished so much at a very young age. It's quite hard to believe sometimes.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, and there's several like that. I think Henry II is another who
Yeah.
uh, who from a very young age established so much, and then but then he has that tragic ending too, right? Because then all of his sons rebel against him multiple times, and he dies. He dies in a situation where Richard has basically crushed what everything he built. Uh, so it's this there's that poetic wheel of fortune once more.
No, absolutely, and I mean, Edward the Longshanks, sort of
Hmm.
stream, Edward the First stream. I mean, I just
Chaddest king
remembered.
ever.
I mean, the one thing that people most overlook is how a member of the Hashsin order snuck into his
That's
bedchamber
hmm
who nearly and went there to stab him, and somehow he over because these, by the way, these weren't just like some random thugs off the street. This was the most feared. They were the most feared in the Islamic world, in the Christian world, because they killed sultans, they killed
hmm
rulers, they killed all sorts of people in the very, very uh, you know effective ways. They were effective assassins, and he just overpowered him and killed him. Like,
I think
well,
he got stabbed, but he managed to kill his attacker. Like,
yeah, he got stout. I think he used like the assassin's knife on sort of take it out of
mhm,
him and use. I can just imagine like him just wrestling it and just like over
yeah.
like Tony Soprano sort of overpowering the like when he was attacked in that sort of hits that sort of thing. It's how I imagine it. But um, yeah, I mean and
Mm,
of course he led the capture of Bethlehem against
that's right.
there's great painting of him where his sword is lunging through the mouth of the Sultan, which he kills single. He rides out actually directly to take on the Sultan. He could that he saw on the battlefield,
Mm,
which again for a young prince. I think he was a prince at the time. Was
that's right. Yeah.
uh
Mhm.
risky move. I mean, yeah, these figures were very unlike, um, you know, the French would call them devils, off the sons of devils, the Plantagenet, because of their
Yeah.
red, not just because of the red hair, but also um, their character. Because
Mm.
even Richard Lionheart at the Siege of Acre jumps off the, he jumps off the boat, it just goes charging in towards the city with an axe. And it's like, and then all his men panic. So, oh, he's charging. We got to catch up with him. This sort of behavior was not
Mhm.
common amongst European monarchs, but yeah.
No, they would stand at the back, right, and direct, because
Yeah,
that's the logical thing to do. You don't want the leader dying halfway through the battle. Um, but these men, and I think the one that typifies it, he wasn't a king, but William Marshall. There's that moment where there's a young Henry III, the country's in civil war. It's possible that a French king might take over, and there's this amazing battle. I can't remember. Is it the Battle of Evesham? Is that right? I can't
yeah,
remember.
Battle of Evesham, yeah, yeah,
And it's really like the fate of the land is on the line here. And Marshall, with a group he's rallied together, is going to take on the rebel barons. And he's 70 at this time, and he gives this thundering speech, and then wants to charge off on the front line, heading the battle. He gets pulled back because he's forgotten to put his helmet on. He's that enthusiastic. But he goes in and leads the cavalry charge against the enemy, and they win the day. That he's this 70-year-old soldier. He was a great warrior, but like most 70-year-olds would not be charging into the midst of battle. But not William Marshall. He did it, and he was still commanding the field at that age. You're just like, wow. The disregard for your own life because you believe in the fight that much. It's a
yeah,
strong trait. Very, very Anglo trait, I think, or at least in the great men of the Anglos, there's been that spirit. Uh, Anglo, I'm using in a very broad sense. Look at something like Rorke's Drift, for example,
yeah,
that kind of last man standing sort of approach, or Nelson, Nelson getting killed at Trafalgar. He's there, like he didn't have to be on that ship, right? He could have been on a ship further back, but he's in the heart of the action. We've always been somewhat perturbed by those who stand at the back and order from the front, order those in front to go over the top without them. We always want that character to lead the way first, um, to share in the suffering.
yeah. It is a very Anglo trait. I mean, Napoleon, he only ever really did that once, and that was his first doing the siege of Toulon, which
Mm,
he was hit, he was injured. He never did that afterwards. I mean, the Ridley Scott film is total nonsense. Yeah, there's just total nonsense. He was always either in the
mhm.
center or the back. I
Yeah,
think at Waterloo he got at the center. The only one of his generals that really did was like proper front line was Marshal Ney, but Marshal Ney was a very good marshal. He gets a lot of bad rep because of the charge at Waterloo with the
hmm,
cavalry at the squares. And I think a bit unfairly in my view, but it is. Yeah, you're right. Even at Waterloo, so many British commanders were killed
yeah,
um, at Waterloo because they were in the front line, like the Greys charge and
that's right.
um, that a lot of them were killed. It's
But the interesting thing about that is, like, so what Wellington is, the victor, and he is held in esteem. But I don't know anyone who feels super strongly about devotion to Wellington in the way that maybe somebody, I know he's a fictional character, but Sharp draws you in because he's there fighting.
mm.
Wellington's
if
not.
if
And
Wellington died, if the battle had won and Wellington
mhm,
died while the French were in retreat, let's say he was shot by a French sniper or he was shot by a marksman and
mhm,
killed, I think you would see that level of devotion.
okay.
Likewise, if Horatio Nelson survived um,
Hmm,
Trafalgar, I don't think you would have seen that sort of that mythological status that Nelson had up until recent decades. Same with Captain
Fair
Cook. I
enough.
mean, I've done a lot of discussions with Duke on Captain Cook. I mean,
Mhm.
he's not much of a sort of naval, but he's an explorer.
Yes.
He discovered Australia. He charted many islands in the Pacific, but as a what it's his death, and many of these people, these great figures, it's their deaths which what propels them to greatness, which is a very bizarre thing. But I think it's because it's kind of like it's in the human mind, you're telling a story of someone's life. There's a beginning and there's an end. Unfortunately for Wellington, he became prime minister and he wasn't a very good prime minister. Um, and so his legacy was kind of ruined because of that, And I wonder, maybe he,
Mm.
maybe maybe he sort of wished that he wondered if the things had turned out differently, then he'd be remembered for that. But you know, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Interesting.
yeah. But I was going to say, yeah. Anyway, thanks for coming on, Nathan. It's been great chatting with you, and people in chat, discussing this because that this is a topic that many people have sort of strong feelings about, and I think this was kind of a fair sort of open discussion
Mhm.
about it because it is something which many people have sort of also felt this and in different maybe for different reasons and different capacities, but it's something which I think is good and a good thing to talk about because um at the end of the day, one thing I hate about our scene at the moment is grifters, is people online
Mhm.
grifters, people who play the part. And I love to argue with my chat and people who in my chat and call them names and berate them and everything as much as the next person. But I always said that I'm honest. If I don't. If I was ever to change the position on something, I would probably explain why, but I've never had to explain myself. Usually, it's kind of
Mm.
self-evident for many people why that's happened. So
Yeah.
I appreciate you coming on because you've done a lot of work on this, and I know it must have been daunting to do that because you don't want to suddenly have like everyone telling you and saying, "Oh, you never liked Tolkien in the first place" or anything like that. So it's
Yeah.
I am glad you've done that because I think that just shows, how sincere you are about the matter, and the fact that you come on here and talk about it and as well, that does show. And I mean, we get it. People, even people in chat, we Vingo and we all get why that's the case, and I think I think it's good and healthy to have that sort of reflection on it.
Well, I'm very grateful to you for having me on and for a good discussion about it. And I mean, we've gone off on so many tangents as well. It's always fun talking to you. But
No,
I also want to thank the guys in the chat and the community more broadly because by and large, folks have been very supportive and rather than kind of dunk on me or have a go at me, have actually been like, well, here's some good advice. We want to help you. We want to reinstall your love of Tolkien, and ultimately that is more important uh, than than uh, than most things in that respect. So I'm very grateful to everyone, and it's nice to know that we're we're a bit of a brotherhood in that respect, and you know, guys have got each other's interest at heart. I think that's actually a really white pilling thing, and I'm very glad of it.
I do think our circle of the Lord of the Rings fan base or the fan base that of the true Lord of the Ring fans, not the people who like just the pure aesthetics of it and then do some
Mhm.
cringe stuff on the side with it. Um, but like what you've built up, what Absolute Majesty have built up online, and many other content, and Connor as well, who's participated in all this, what you
Mhm.
guys what we created, and the people in chat. I think there are a lot of fan bases out there which are just blindly follow because it's like their team, like it's
Yeah.
like a football team and stuff. So they blindly follow. They don't think and thinking is a very important factor, especially in today's world, because not many people do think. They don't think, they don't question, they don't have any of these sorts of
Yeah.
reflective ways of thinking, and that's the biggest problem in our one of the biggest problems in our society. And the fact that we're able to do this, and people in chat are, and people in your chat were able to go through the motions of this, I think just shows that the fan base, the sort of Tolkien sort of brotherhood fan base, what we like to call it, is strong. It's stronger than ever. It's a very strong good. I mean, the fact that we were able to not fall for any childish behaviors. I mean, and there's so much when you see a lot of these people that it's just, some of it is just delves into child and it puts you off anyway. But yeah, no,
Yeah.
I'm really glad we've come on here and done this.
Me too. Me too. Thank you so much.
No worries, and yeah, everybody check out, and oh yeah, and I still have my still holding my threats that if I do not get to 1,000 subs, I will do a live reading of 120 Days of Sodom by by Marquis de Sade. That is my threat to everybody on the online. I will, if I do not reach 1,000 like in a month's time, I'm going to do a live like 24-hour reading.
Hey, you might get a different kind of subscriber if you do that.
Yeah, I don't know. I've had a few subscribers who have said, actually, no, I'm going to unsubscribe just because I want to listen to you do it. So maybe the threat is not, it's all backfiring. I mean, I've sort of shot myself
Yeah,
in the foot with
indeed.
this one.
You'll lose the good ones, the good solid brotherhood guys, and you'll end up with a bunch of subversives who enjoy the Marquis de Sade and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I know. I get like a sort of strange BDSM sort of socialist type. Yeah. Oh dear. Um, I mean, the trouble is, I have threatened, and I've set down the gauntlet. I cannot back out
Mm,
now. It's, I've
it's a matter of
I have
honor.
I know I cannot. I just cannot do it. So everyone, you have to stop me. You just have to stop me from doing it now.
You just have to subscribe, guys. Just do
Yeah,
it.
subscribe.
This is
Otherwise,
the
you're gonna have to
weirdest
listen to the.
shill I've ever come across.
y-
It's
y- y- Yeah, I am being haunted by the ghost of a French pervert, and I must be stopped.
oh wow, wow. Well, on that happy note,
Yes.
I must go.
Yeah. Yeah. Good night, Nathan, and good night, chat. Thanks all for joining.
Night,
Good night.
everyone.